They called the sheriff's office because they said I was trespassing on private property. The funny part was, the property they were pointing at had been in my family since Grover Cleveland was president. 6 minutes after the deputies stepped out of their cruiser, one of them looked me straight in the eye and said, "Sir, I owe you an apology. If you've ever watched somebody's confidence disappear in real time, you know it's almost quiet, like a balloon losing air. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 53 years old, and I'm the fourth generation to run Carter Vineyards in Redwood Valley, Northern California. My great-grandfather planted the first vines here back in 1891, when this valley was mostly dirt roads, horses, and families who knew each other's names. I grew up believing land wasn't something you owned forever. It was something you borrowed from the people before you so you could hand it to the people after you. My dad used to tell me, "The vineyard doesn't belong to us, son. We're just taking care of it until the next Carter is old enough." That sentence stuck with me longer than any business lesson ever did. Life out here had always been predictable. Spring meant pruning. Summer meant long days under the sun. Harvest season meant everyone was exhausted but smiling because hard work finally turned into something you could pour into a glass. We weren't rich, at least not the way people on television define rich. Most of what we owned was tied up in dirt, vines, tractors that were older than some of my employees, and memories you couldn't insure. About 4 years ago, everything around us started changing. A developer bought the ridge overlooking our vineyard and carved it into 60 luxury homes with giant windows facing the valley. The brochures called it Cedar Crest Estates. They promised peaceful country living with breathtaking vineyard views. I remember laughing when I first saw that slogan, because those views had been there 100 years before the developers arrived. The families who moved in weren't bad people, at least not most of them. They waved when they drove by. Some bought wine from our tasting room. Kids would point at the tractors like they were dinosaurs. Honestly, I liked seeing young families around again. There was one thing connecting the subdivision to the main highway, an old gravel access road that crossed a corner of my property. It wasn't a public road. Never had been. My grandfather built it with his own bulldozer decades earlier because neighboring ranchers needed the shortcut, and over time we simply let people use it. Nobody asked permission anymore. Nobody paid. Nobody argued. It was just one of those unspoken agreements country people understand. Then the Homeowners Association elected a new president. Her name was Vanessa Holloway. She had moved from Silicon Valley after selling some tech company, drove a brand new electric SUV that probably cost more than my first house, and carried herself like every room belonged to her before she walked into it. The first time we met, she smiled without ever really looking at me. "You own the vineyard?" she asked. "My family does," I answered. She glanced toward my equipment yard where 2 harvesters and an old blue tractor were parked. Such a beautiful view. Shame about all the machinery. I chuckled because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. A week later, an official HOA letter arrived in my mailbox. According to Vanessa, several residents had complained that my farm equipment lowered neighborhood property values because it was visible from their second-story decks. The letter politely requested that I relocate my tractors, trailers, fertilizer tanks, and harvesting equipment somewhere they could no longer be seen. I read it twice, set it on the kitchen table, and my wife Claire looked over my shoulder. "They're serious?" she asked. I slid the paper toward her and poured myself another cup of coffee. "Apparently tractors are offensive now." She laughed so hard she almost spilled hers. I ignored the letter because, honestly, what was I supposed to do? Hide an entire working vineyard behind a curtain? Harvest season arrived, and we worked sunrise to sunset. Combines rolled through the vines. Forklifts carried bins of grapes. Workers shouted back and forth across the rows. It was noisy, dusty, and absolutely beautiful. 2 weeks later, another surprise showed up, except this one wasn't an envelope. It was 2 county inspectors taking pictures of my trucks. Someone had reported commercial vehicles illegally blocking a public roadway. Public roadway. Those words bothered me enough that I stopped what I was doing and asked one inspector who made the complaint. He couldn't tell me, but the answer wasn't hard to guess. That evening, I walked into the old office behind our winery, where dusty filing cabinets held more family history than most museums. I unlocked the bottom drawer, pulled out maps older than my father, original survey records, yellow deeds with signatures fading into the paper, and one leather folder my grandfather had always called the box nobody should ever need. I spread everything across the desk, and as the sun disappeared behind the vines, I started reading line after line, realizing I wasn't looking for permission anymore. I was looking for proof. because something deep in my gut told me this wasn't about tractors at all. It was about somebody who had confused being new with being in charge. And by the time I found the original easement documents, I knew the next morning was going to change everything. The document sitting on top of the stack wasn't even the oldest one. It was just the one that mattered most. It was an easement agreement signed nearly 70 years earlier, and the language couldn't have been clearer if somebody had carved it into stone. My family retained full ownership of the access road at all times. Neighboring property owners were granted permission to use it as a courtesy, not as a right, and that permission could be withdrawn by the owner with proper notice. I leaned back in my chair, looked around the little office where 4 generations of Carters had balanced checkbooks, argued over weather forecasts, and celebrated harvests, and I couldn't help smiling. My grandfather always said paperwork is boring until the day it saves your life. Well, this was that day. Before sunrise, I called an old friend named Roy, a retired surveyor who'd spent 40 years mapping property lines all over the county. By 8 o'clock, he was standing beside me with his GPS equipment, comparing modern coordinates to maps drawn before World War II. After about an hour, he looked up and grinned. "Ethan, they're standing on your road." "You sure?" I asked. He laughed. "I've never been more sure of anything. If this survey's wrong, then California's in the Pacific." That was all I needed to hear. I spent the afternoon calling contractors instead of lawyers. Around here, solving problems usually starts with equipment before paperwork. By the following morning, a crew was pouring concrete footings beside the entrance, and by sunset, a massive black steel gate stood where cars had driven freely for decades. We installed keypad access, heavy-duty hinges, a security camera, and reflective signs that read "Private Property, Authorized Access Only." I didn't enjoy doing it, but I wasn't angry anymore either. Anger burns hot and disappears fast. This felt different. This felt like finally locking the front door after realizing strangers had convinced themselves they lived in your house. Before anyone could accuse me of acting unfairly, I mailed certified notices to the HOA board explaining everything. 14 days notice before restricted access. Copies of the deed. Copies of the easement. County survey references. Contact information if they wish to negotiate a legal access agreement. I wasn't trying to trap anyone. I was giving them every opportunity to solve the problem like adults. My phone started ringing before lunch. I ignored the first 6 calls because I already knew who they were from. Eventually, I answered. Vanessa didn't even say hello. "You need to remove that gate immediately." "Good afternoon to you too," I replied. "You're blocking public access." "Actually," I said, glancing at the survey spread across my desk, "I'm securing private property." Her voice sharpened. "Our attorney says you're violating county regulations." "Interesting. Don't play games with me. I'm not. Tell your attorney to pull parcel map 14B and the original easement. Then have him call me back." She hung up without another word. 25 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time, it really was the attorney. His tone was noticeably calmer. "Mr. Carter, perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." "Funny," I answered. "That's exactly what I thought." He admitted he'd reviewed the survey and realized ownership wasn't as straightforward as the HOA believed. I almost laughed because it was actually very straightforward. They just hadn't bothered reading anything before making demands. He suggested we meet to discuss a compromise. I reminded him that compromise had already been sitting in every board member's mailbox in the form of my certified letter. They had 14 days. Plenty of time. News spread through Cedar Crest faster than wildfire. Residents suddenly realized their easy 5-minute shortcut could disappear. A few people came to my winery personally. Some apologized for the complaints, saying they never knew the road wasn't public. Others admitted they hadn't even voted for Vanessa. One young couple brought homemade cookies and looked genuinely embarrassed. The husband rubbed the back of his neck and said, "Honestly, we thought the HOA owned everything outside the neighborhood." I smiled. That's usually how HOAs like people to think. They laughed, and for the first time since all this started, I remembered most of these families weren't my enemies. They'd simply trusted the wrong person. Vanessa, on the other hand, doubled down. She started posting updates in the community forum claiming I was holding 60 families hostage. According to her, I was trying to extort the neighborhood. Reading those posts almost made me question myself. Almost. Then I'd walk outside, see the vines my great-grandfather planted with his own hands, and remember exactly why I wasn't backing down. You don't preserve something for over a century by surrendering it every time someone louder demands it. Day 14 arrived. The notice period expired. At 6 o'clock the next morning, I activated the gate. Cars lined up almost immediately. Some drivers punched random codes. Others got out and read the signs. A few simply turned around and headed toward the county highway, beginning the 23-minute detour that everybody had hoped to avoid. By 8:30, my phone was vibrating nonstop. Claire looked at me while we were eating breakfast and asked, "You nervous?" I buttered another piece of toast and shrugged. "Honestly, a little." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Your grandfather would have locked it years ago." Around lunchtime, I heard tires crunching across the gravel. 3 sheriff's vehicles rolled toward the entrance, followed by Vanessa's luxury SUV. Even from 50 yards away, I could see the confidence in the way she climbed out. She wasn't smiling anymore. She looked victorious. I walked toward the gate carrying nothing but a folder under my arm. One deputy introduced himself politely. "Sir, we've received reports you're preventing lawful access and trespassing on HOA property." Before I answered, Vanessa stepped forward and pointed directly at me. "That's him. He's refusing to leave community property and illegally trapping homeowners." I looked at the deputy instead of her. "Would you mind taking a look at something before we go any further?" I handed him the folder. Inside were certified copies of the deed, the easement agreement, the current county survey, and tax parcel records. He flipped through the pages slowly while another deputy walked over to compare the legal description with a map on his tablet. Nobody spoke for what felt like forever. Vanessa crossed her arms and tapped her foot impatiently. Finally, the first deputy looked up. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "how long have you believed this road belonged to the HOA?" "Since the development was built." "Do you have documentation showing that?" She hesitated for the first time. "Our attorney said." The deputy gently interrupted her. Respectfully, "That's not documentation." He turned back toward me. "Mr. Carter, according to these records, this road is part of your parcel. The easement appears revocable under the terms stated here, and it looks like you've already provided legal notice." Then he did something I honestly didn't expect. He extended his hand. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, sir. We had to respond to the complaint." I shook his hand and told him I understood. They were just doing their jobs. Vanessa's face turned pale. She looked from the deputies to the gate, then back to me, like reality itself had betrayed her. One of the other residents who'd followed behind quietly whispered, "Wait, we've been wrong this whole time?" Nobody answered because nobody needed to. The silence answered for all of us. Before leaving, the deputy looked toward the gathering homeowners and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This is a civil property matter. Mr. Carter has committed no criminal offense." Those words echoed through the crowd harder than anyone shouting ever could. Within hours, someone uploaded cell phone footage of the confrontation. Local television stations picked up the story that evening. By the next morning, the video had exploded online. Thousands of strangers were debating easements, property rights, and HOA overreach. The comments were brutal, and for the first time since Vanessa had arrived in the valley, she wasn't controlling the story anymore. The facts were, the only question left was whether the HOA would finally admit they had made a mistake, or whether pride was about to become a very expensive habit. The funny thing about leverage is that most people don't realize they've lost it until they're asking for permission instead of making demands. 3 days after the deputies left, my phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Vanessa. It was the same attorney, only his voice sounded about 10 years older than it had the week before. "Mr. Carter," he said, "my clients would like to reopen discussions." I looked out the office window toward the gate where another line of cars was taking the long way around the valley. "That's probably a good idea," I answered. We met the following Friday inside our tasting room. The same room where tourists usually sampled Cabernet and talked about weather suddenly became a negotiating table. Vanessa sat at one end looking exhausted. Gone was the polished confidence she'd worn the first day we met. She avoided eye contact almost the entire meeting. The attorney opened a folder and admitted what nobody on their side had been willing to say before. They had relied on assumptions instead of records. They believed the developer had transferred permanent access rights to the HOA, but after reviewing every document available, they now understood that had never happened. I appreciated the honesty, even if it had arrived a little late. I poured everyone a glass of water before speaking. "I'm not interested in punishing families who bought homes without knowing the history," I said. "Most of your residents have treated us with respect. This isn't about revenge." Vanessa finally looked up. "Then what is it about?" I answered without raising my voice. "Respect. Boundaries." and understanding that just because something has always been free doesn't mean it belongs to you. Nobody argued with that. The room stayed quiet long enough for everyone to think about it. Then I slid a contract across the table. It wasn't complicated. A 10-year access lease. $2,400 a month. The HOA would maintain the road at its own expense, carry liability insurance, obey a 15-mile-per-hour speed limit through the vineyard, and understand that one late payment would result in the gate remaining closed for 24 hours. A second missed payment would terminate the agreement entirely. The attorney read every page carefully, occasionally adjusting his glasses before asking a question. Vanessa barely spoke. I could almost see the realization settling in that this agreement was still far better than asking 60 families to waste nearly an extra hour driving every single day. After about 40 minutes, the attorney placed his pen on the table and nodded. I believe these terms are reasonable. Vanessa hesitated for several long seconds before finally signing her name. There wasn't any dramatic speech, no apology anyone would remember forever, just ink drying on paper. And sometimes that's exactly what justice looks like. The first payment arrived the following week without a single issue. $28,800 a year for a road my great-grandfather built with equipment that would look prehistoric today. Every dollar went straight into maintaining the vineyard, replacing aging irrigation lines, repairing tractors, and setting aside money so one day my grandson, if he wants this life, won't inherit a place that's falling apart. A month later, I was checking irrigation pumps when I heard the familiar hum of an electric SUV approaching the gate. The keypad beeped. The steel gate slowly opened, and Vanessa drove past the same tractor she once demanded I hide. For just a second, our eyes met. She gave a small nod. I nodded back. No bitterness, no celebration. Just two people who had learned very different lessons from the same road. Looking back now, I don't think this story was ever really about an HOA, a gate, or even property rights. It was about something much older than that. Somewhere along the way, people started confusing convenience with entitlement. They enjoyed a kindness for so long that they forgot it had begun as kindness in the first place. My family never charged anyone because helping neighbors was simply what decent people did. But generosity only survives when it's met with gratitude. The moment someone starts treating your generosity like an obligation, it's no longer generosity, it's surrender. My grandfather understood that long before I did. That's probably why he kept every survey, every deed, every faded document locked away in that old cabinet. He wasn't expecting a fight. He was protecting the truth, because memories fade, opinions change, and people tell themselves convenient stories. But recorded deeds have a way of cutting through all the noise. Even today, every time I unlock that gate before sunrise, I think about him smiling somewhere, probably saying, "Paperwork may not grow grapes, son, but it'll sure protect the ground they grow on." And honestly, I think he'd be proud that we defended what generations before us worked so hard to preserve without ever forgetting to treat people fairly once the dust settled. Now I'd love to hear what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have kept letting everyone use the road for free after everything that happened? Or would you have locked the gate for good? And if you lived in that neighborhood, would you blame the HOA president, the developer, or the homeowners who simply trusted what they were told? Share your thoughts in the comments because stories like this always spark great conversations. If you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stick around. Because sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought in courtrooms at all. They're fought one property line at a time.